Have you ever met a person who radiated evil? What were they like? Extreme narcissist, the guy sent emails to me and my boss about my poor work performance. While I was sitting at my dying mother's hospital bed. When I returned from that trip a week later, he was literally standing in my office with a tape measure. Apparently. He took my absence as an opportunity to take my office permanently. I have a higher job title than this guy to top it off. And no. He didn't get the office. I went to pick up a takeout order at a restaurant bar near me. I walk inside and there is a guy standing by the door also waiting for his takeout order. He never said a word, just stared at me the entire time he was waiting. My gut told me I was unsafe. The cashier gave him his food and he stood there for a minute or two, like he was thinking of a reason to stall. He asked a cashier for another order of wings. I texted my husband and asked if he could pick me up because this guy was giving me the creeps. As soon as my husband arrived, creepy guy said, "Actually, I think I'm fine with a dozen, you guys enjoy those wings," and he left. I get the chills thinking about how I could have potentially been mugged, or worse if I didn't listen to my gut that night. Years back I was working on a mural project with a non-profit. Part of the gig was 1 day a week to teach the 7 to 12-year-olds art. There was an 8 to 10-year-old brother and sister in one group. The brother bullied the sister mercilessly, no other kid would get near him, they all knew he was trouble. We separated the two, but once your back was turned he was right back hitting her and even biting her. The last straw was when he took a newly sharpened pencil and straight up stabbed her in the hand. There was screaming. Crying. Blood everywhere. They called the parents, but I insisted on her being taken to the hospital as the pencil was halfway through her hand. The brother had no remorse and even a smirk on his face. His eyes were very dark and dead, looking like in shows where they show a pic of a killer and people describe them being dead-eyed. The ambulance comes as the parents get there. This is clearly not the first time something like this has happened. Because they didn't complete the activity the non-profit wanted the two back in the next week, I flat out refused, which caused a big deal. I put my foot down and wouldn't relent. I told them that kid needs help, and so does the sister. Later on, the coordinator told me that the year before they had to take away his drawings because he would draw pictures of kids bleeding and drew dead animals. Like, how many warning signs do you need? That kid needs help. There was this guy who grew up in the neighboring street as me, and he was just a really bad person. It probably doesn't sound like much now, but when he was about 11 he'd do things like borrow video games, never give them back, and then just swear blind he never borrowed them in the first place. This sounds minor, but it kind of went from there really. As he got older he'd start to steal money, beat the shit out of people for no reason, etc. His ex-girlfriend took out a restraining order on him after they broke up because she was frightened of him. The best example I can give of what he was like was when he heard that someone had said something about him that he'd taken offense to. The person who'd done this was in the pub one afternoon with his wife and kids, and this guy walks into the pub, doesn't say a word, and just headbutts him in front of his family. But at the same time, he could be quite well-spoken and charming when he wanted something from somebody, and it's only recently occurred to me that he's obviously a sociopath. He's now living in a tent and addicted to heroin, and I think it was always going to go that way. In high school I helped my friend babysit a group of kids for a local church. The adults were doing some kind of Bible study, and there were about 6 to 7 children between the two of us babysitters. The main couple that was heading the group were the pastors of the church. The husband seemed a little weird, but mostly gave off pushover vibes, whereas the wife immediately made me feel uneasy. Something about her seemed off, like she was there but not entirely aware of other people or something. Almost like she would be saying and doing everything in the exact same wooden way with her without anyone else there. This couple had 3 adopted kids, and one was a 5-year-old Russian boy that the mom literally referred to as the orphan a few times. She told my friend and I very blankly how we can't give in to his demands because he has little orphan boy syndrome, so don't give him any snacks or any privileges when he asks. This little boy definitely had some psychological and possible developmental issues, but was honestly one of the more endearing kids in that group and was nowhere near as creepy as the mom or the other 2 siblings made him out to be. The other 2 kept him at a distance and wouldn't directly speak to him, but would talk to us to communicate with him. Like staring me down with tunnel vision and telling me Victor needs to stop playing with his napkin, as Victor was right next to them trying to tell them something and waving his napkin at them. When the parents finished their Bible study, the dad came back in first and played with the kids, including the Russian one, and he seemed like a genuinely kind person that loved the kids. Then when the mom entered the room, the entire dynamic shifted and the dad and two kids stopped interacting with the Russian kid and became much more formal, and the mom immediately began lecturing my friend and I about how the Russian kid was not to be playing with his sister's Legos. She said something to my friend about how this is the burden God has given this family and we must follow through with it now. This poor little kid definitely seemed to have issues, but the mom struck me as being an insidiously sadistic and abusive person. The way her voice never changed tone, and her facial and bodily expressions and movements never wavered gave me the biggest case of the creeps. I wish my friend and I would have known better then and had reported this to CPS. I've always had a bad feeling about the situation and wish I would have acted better to help those poor kids. The mom seemed like she could have strangled one of them, then calmly kept making dinner as if absolutely nothing had just happened. Worked with this guy who was very outgoing, and most would describe him as nice but a little odd. He always made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and avoided him when I could. A work friend asked why I was rude to him and all I could say is that he gave me the creeps. He had never did anything specific or say weird things, it was just odd vibes. His wife and he killed a little girl they adopted. Beat her to death. Trust your instincts. I grew up under the thumb of an abusive mother. Trigger warning, this is violent. I remember very starkly the first time she choked me. I don't remember what set her off, but she grabbed me by the back of my neck and threw me across the room, and I landed on my back. Had a coughing fit because of how hard I hit the floor, and while coughing I felt hands wrap around my throat. Opened my eyes to see her crouching over me, choking me. Her face was all twisted, but her eyes were different. Her eyes were all squished up in anger, but her actual eyeballs just seemed blank. She was so angry and so devoid of emotion at the same time. She just watched me sputter. I wound up passing out from her choking me. She left me there to wake up alone. I had bruises for a few weeks, a bruise all over my back, and my voice was gone for at least a week and a half. She never addressed it. I was maybe 8. I am safe now. Yesterday was a year since I cut contact. But I'll never forget that experience. My mother. Spent the first 15 years of my life in hell because of her. Haven't seen or spoken to her in almost 20 years now, and I still get a cold chill down my spine when I think of her. She was very abusive and manipulative. She always told me she hated me from the time she found out she was pregnant. I believe her because her actions confirmed it. My wife's mother is like this. Her father was an abusive alcoholic. The mother would get the father worked into a rage until he started beating her and then call the children in to watch. She would regularly get him worked up until he worked over my wife. As a child, she was the firstborn in the family. When she was born they sent her back to India because in their culture I guess babysitters weren't a thing, the family or village cared for the children. So when my wife was 5, they brought her back from India. She had no idea who her parents were, they were strangers. There was no bond. This reminded my mother-in-law of her father's family, whom she hated. My wife had a bond with the father's family, but not the mother's family. So, my wife became the scapegoat, the black sheep of the family, and she bore the brunt of it. She wasn't really allowed to have friends at school or play with friends, as the eldest she was expected to do most of the chores. At one point, they moved back to India when my wife was maybe 7 to 10 years old or similar, and the neighbors would walk by and hear the mother beating her daughter so frequently that they approached my wife and asked her if she would like to be adopted. They returned to North America, and regular beatings continued. I think at around 19 or 20 years old my wife ran away from home to escape the crazy, which is probably unacceptable in this culture. You only move out when you get married, I guess. So my mother-in-law was so incredibly angry that she told the next oldest daughter that my wife had died. The mental stress from the situation was so great that it triggered my wife's younger sister to have some kind of psychotic break, which developed into permanent schizophrenia. She now lives in a group home, and to this day, over 30 years later, when she sees my wife she will often cry out, "My God, you're alive. You're alive." I think they blame my wife for running away. I could go on for days, I haven't scratched the surface. My dad. After a particularly bad fight with my mom, where he ended up beating her nearly unconscious, he kidnapped my brother and I when we were toddlers while trying to avoid arrest. Not sure if my mom didn't charge him or what. As we were growing up, he started to beat my brother, and I as well. He would act normal in front of his friends despite hitting us moments before they saw him. When I was 18, he tried to beat my brother, who was fighting back and not allowing the beatings to happen now that he was older and bigger. And when my dad started losing the fight, he broke a beer bottle against a wall and tried to stab my brother. I grabbed the pocket knife I was carrying and told my dad I'd stab him if he came any closer to my brother. My mom finally called the cops and they charged him with assault with a deadly weapon. The police sent him to a mental hospital for a week's evaluation as my family began packing our things so we could move in with other family by the time he was home. My entire family called the mental hospital and told them to be extremely careful when evaluating him. He had successfully manipulated people his entire life. My family packed our things and moved in with family he had never been met before. 3 days later, the mental hospital released him on good behavior, and because he made a few cards to my mom explaining how he was going to be better and how he was sorry. On the way home from the mental hospital, he spotted by a hardware store and bought multiple knives, a saw, and some rope. He put them in his backpack on top of his card saying he was sorry and that he was going to be better from now on. He came home to an empty house. Unexpectedly, he messaged every family member asking us to forgive him and come home so we could talk things out. None of us responded. He used the rope to hang himself once he realized his plan to murder us had completely failed. A former patient of mine. I'm not squeamish, at all, but that guy creeped me out. There was always a feeling of unease, of lurking danger. He didn't stare or anything conventionally creepy, he was so ill he couldn't move without assistance. Just that feeling, and it was worst when he finally died. I've seen my fair share of corpses, and usually there is a feeling of peace and okayness. Back then I worked with the very old folks. Not with this guy, oh no. It was pure discomfort, hitting you in the face. A kind of appalling wrongness and overwhelming feeling that this guy was not going to a nice place. I almost believed that was hell looking at him, and I'm an atheist. What I found out a week later was almost relieving. He presumably killed his own baby boy because he was in the way. The older boy wasn't so much of a burden, but he gave him into a children's home for 2 years. All because he wanted to build a house in peace. His wife was in another ward at the same time, suffering dementia, and she walked around all day with a little puppet you weren't allowed to touch, crying most of the time. His living son was as much at her side as he could be. He told us all of this. He said his mother had that puppet for years, always searching for his little brother. He also told us he's just so glad that his father was dead. He never said father or dad, he said the full name. His and his mother's life were pure torture, but he couldn't leave her alone with his father. He didn't even want to see him or anything. Late to the party, but my ex-wife's mother was a real-life nurse Ratched. Same reptilian mannerisms, same condescending voice, same hair even. It was uncanny valley kind of shit because she was even a psychiatric nurse. Her own children told her, right before surgery to remove a golf ball-sized brain tumor, that if she wanted to make any changes to her personality, now was the time. They'd blame all her prior shenanigans on the tumor. To absolutely no one's surprise, she came out the other surgery with her switch still flipped to evil. She spent the entirety of my relationship with my ex trying to break us up, and for all I know she succeeded. Every time she looked at me, it was like she'd just scraped me off the bottom of her shoe. When her own mother complained about the car doing funny things while she was driving, she decided her mother was just going senile and imagining things, and took away her driving privileges, and therefore her last remaining vestige of independence. Well, my ex and I discovered, around a year later, a puddle of transmission fluid on the garage floor of her grandmother's house. Turns out the transmission had been slipping. Her grandmother died 3 years later. She changed the date of her daughter and my wedding around so many times that no one from my family was able to attend. One agreed upon date was particularly objectionable because Sundays aren't for getting married, they're for going to church. One of the best outcomes of my ex leaving me is that I'll never have to see discount nurse Ratched again for the rest of my life. I was just a kid and my parents were visiting my dad's mom and half-brother. During our visit, my parents, siblings and I took a trip to visit a man-made lake that my dad was curious about just out of town. While driving around it, Dad noticed his ex-stepdad's truck and he pulled over to see if he was around. Out popped my ex-grandfather and smiles as he embraces my dad. I had never met the guy, but had heard a lot about him and knew that him and my grandmother had been divorced for a number of years. While ever curious about this man, that was in half of my dad's years, I hopped out the car to say hello. Just half a meter away I felt pressure around my body and instantly felt the need to be alert. Frightened by the sensation, I grabbed onto my dad and timidly said hello before my dad quickly ended the conversation and took me to the car. A few years later, after reminiscing on memories, Dad told me he remembered that experience and told me that he noticed I felt the man's evil aura and he felt the need to protect me. A little while later, as an adult listening to my dad and his siblings talk, I learned that he had been in prison for sexual assault and that he also sexually assaulted his children. For all I know, there's probably more disgusting things he's done that I have not been told, but his children, that still hold his family name, are in the process of taking on the surnames of my grandmother and her relatives, so they don't have anything that associated with him. Honestly, really glad that I learned all this in a timely way and that my dad had enough sense to notice I was uncomfortable. My senior year in high school, I was taking an art class. Most of the other students were juniors or seniors. In the middle of the school year, we had this freshman kid join the class. He would sit at the same table as me and my friends in the class. Our art teacher was cool, and we had a door that went outside to the side of the school that she would let us go out and smoke cigarettes. One day, sitting at the table, this kid says, "One time I ate 4 cigarettes." Like what? We just thought he was a weirdo. I was going to the restroom one day from the art class and I go out in the hallway and he's opening the janitor's closet, looks around and goes into the janitor's closet. Being all sneaky like. How he didn't see me, or maybe he just didn't care if I seen him go into the janitor's closet. I have no idea what he was doing. I just thought he was being weird. Couple months later, he's gone. Front page of the newspaper is an article about him being sentenced for raping a 3-year-old girl. Come to find out, the school was very aware of this and had put him in our art class so the teacher could keep an eye on him. The worst part, in the paper they quoted him as saying, "She was asking for it." Regarding the rape. How the hell is a 3-year-old gonna be asking to have sex? Like this kid thought he could get away with it or something. This dude was whack. Kid I shared a few classes with in middle school. I think we were both 13. He had a charming smile, but it always felt off to me, like he was wearing a mask. There was nothing in his eyes when he smiled. He was in a lot of school groups. Kiwanis, Amnesty International, 4-H Junior Civics Club, etc. If there was something to protest, he was the most outraged. If there was something to mourn, he was the saddest. If there was something to cheer, he was the loudest. But between those times he was blank. If you were looking, he'd have a pleasantly neutral smile on his face. However, there were a few times I caught him when he thought no one was looking and he was just empty. Cold. There was something just immensely soulfully chilling about him. One day he stopped showing up to school and no one knew why. Some of the girls in our class eventually went to his house to see if he was okay. Not me, I never wanted to be near him. Turns out, he was the reason the neighborhood cats kept going missing. He got caught skinning a cat alive in an empty lot. The poor cat screaming caught the attention of someone and he was busted. When they went to check his room, they found his kill list. It included every animal. All pets that he had caught, tortured, and killed. The list was very detailed. No clue where they put him, but I sincerely hope he never gets out. My neighbor. Something was off. She was a skinny, frail mid-30s woman with a son. The son was about 8 to 9, he was off as well, something just not right and eerie. They were always trying to make small talk at the fence when getting into my car or into the front yard. One day, the kid says, "Help, come, I think someone is trying to break into," which I replied, "Did you call 911? He said, "No," then I replied, "Where is your mom?" He said, "Inside." Then the kid badgered me to come inside and check. I pretty much said, "No way, your mom is in there." In my head, you guys are crazy, and if she don't care to move then must be just fine. Anyways, they move out. Few months later she's in the news. She had a chopped up body in her freezer. When they moved it thawed a bit before cooling again at new residence, and the scent drew some attention and was discovered. I can see the evil in her smile 5 years later. There was a kid I met in high school that I remember instantly hating just by looking at him. I'm not a violent person, never been in a fight in my life, but as soon as I saw this kid I wanted to bash his face in, and that feeling persisted all throughout school. He was kind of a bully ringleader, but never really put himself in a position to get in trouble. Also was a rich kid, so was pretty instantly popular. Years after high school I read in the paper that he got arrested with large quantities of drugs and unregistered guns in his car after attempting to shoot his parents. I remember the kid always had this really punchable smirk on his face, think like Joffrey from Game of Thrones, but Erlen not acting. Always laughing at the misfortune of others, often causing it by goading his friends into bullying people. I was 6'2", 240 pounds in high school, so they never really messed with me, but the group was big enough that they probably could have kicked my ass if they had wanted to. I just kept my distance. Thanks for watching. If you like the video please drop a like, and to stay up to date with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button under this video.